Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven, and our guest today is Cash Nickerson. He's a friend of mine. He's the author of 6 books, including his latest. It's a Wall Street Journal bestseller. It's titled Negotiation as a Martial Art, Techniques to Master the Art of Human Exchange. So before I tell you a little bit more about the book and a little more about Cash, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Well, I'm really excited about the conversation. Congratulations on the bestseller status, by the way.
Thank you.
I read The Hollywood Reporter, a writer there did a review. Good writer. He calls the book, quote, valid and wholly knowledgeable guide, wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, not like holy with an H. It's a valid and wholly knowledgeable guide in it's subverting the typical, potentially ignoramus-based assumptions about the art of being a good negotiator. Was that the writer's line, or is that your line? What's a ignoramus-based assumption?
I don't know, Mark. I don't even know who reviews this. That one was sent to me. Somebody said, "Hey, did you see this review?" Which I had not. And but it's interesting. Some of the reviews, I've had 2 reviews out of Hollywood, and I think it's because they find the book entertaining.
Yeah.
I mean, it's meant to be entertaining. I think we gain the most from knowledge that's kind of fun. And so one reviewer out of Hollywood said this is basically so much better than Trump's books. I can't believe anybody reads Trump's books because, this isn't all about this guy and this vanity thing. He just puts it out there. So I'm kind of pleased that the Hollywood people like it, even though I don't expect it to be turned into a movie anytime soon.
Well, I guess it makes sense. I mean, I guess there is a lot of deal making here, maybe in the context then of the entertainment industry.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think there's a recognition, more so maybe in the arts world, that negotiation really is an art. And so I think it partially falls under that. And the title is somewhat seductive in that regard, because here's negotiation as a martial art, which immediately, sounds dramatic and interesting and almost fictional.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back and talk more about all of these elements, that your martial arts practice, negotiating, and what you've learned. Before, I want to read a little bit more about your background, though. Cash, one quick question. I think I know the answer to this, but for the audience who might be wondering, Cash is a given name or a nickname?
It is my middle name, my legal official birth certificate, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Stephen Cash Nickerson. And I wear it with pride because my mother and father moved from Florida for my dad's first job, and they got everything they owned into the trunk of their car, and they needed money. And back then it wasn't as common, of course, for women to work in 1959. And my mother took a job demonstrating and selling vacuum cleaners at J.C. Penney. Now, it would take someone like my mother to find out that J.C. Penney's middle name was Cash.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that he became a retailer. If he had a name Cash Penny, what else are you going to do, right? And so she was hoping someday I would be successful. And I'll just say proudly that my mother hasn't had to pay a bill in many, many years.
Well, it's good to hear the background on the name. I thought maybe it was a family name, but that's a much more interesting story.
And it is now. My son is Andrew Cash, and he has guaranteed that when he has a son, that'll be a middle name Cash. So it's definitely going to be multi-generational now.
Well, very cool. So let me tell you a little bit more about Cash. Again, our guest, Cash Nickerson. He does a lot of things. He is the chairman of AKKA North America's business unit. He was the president, CFO, general counsel, and the second largest shareholder of a company, PDS Tech, prior to its acquisition by AKKA Technologies a few years back. Cash has previously held roles including being an attorney and a marketing executive for Union Pacific Railroad, an associate and then a partner at Jenner & Block in Chicago, and chairman and CEO of an internet company. He is a visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis School of Law, where he teaches. negotiation, and he has JD and MBA degrees. And I saw him on TV yesterday doing the promotional rounds for the book. So thank you for coming on my little podcast after being on TV sets across the country. Hopefully your favorite mistake story isn't about your TV appearances yesterday.
No, fortunately those went well, even though in 4 hours I did 24 interviews.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to be. Well, no, I say you probably weren't talked out, but is it tiring that you've got lights and a little bit of pressure?
It's the best way to do them is to actually be repetitive. Mm-hmm. And that's the hardest thing, is to remember exactly what you said last time, because you don't have a teleprompter and you can't see the person with whom you're speaking, because you just hear in your ear, okay, now you'll be talking to Randy from Indianapolis, and say hello to Randy. Hello, Randy. And then Randy starts to ask you questions.
Yeah. Well, I bet one question you didn't get asked yesterday is the question we always ask guests here. Looking back at your career, all the different things that you've done, Cash, what is your favorite mistake?
It's interesting. I love your question. And I think when everyone hears that question, my favorite mistake, or, I think initially, because we all, once we get to a certain stage in life, have so many mistakes, we have one of two reactions. One reaction is, how will I choose? Yeah. Which everyone would feel. It's like, wow. Another reaction is like, I hate thinking about my mistakes. I'm a very positive person. Let's just keep moving forwards. Another reaction, which is where I ended up, is I actually don't have to talk about one of my mistakes for it to be my favorite mistake. Oh. And so I kind of have made this same mistake, but it's a more dramatic and colorful story around one I witnessed, and then managed to repeat. Everyone thinks, well, if you see a mistake, you'll avoid it in the future. That's just not my experience, because, that's why they call them mistakes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what happened? What did you see?
Well, and I talk about this in the book. And so it's kind of fun because it's about negotiations and it's about deals. And one of the premises of my book, Mark, is that deals are emotional. I don't care. People think of maybe buying a house as being emotional and a car as being emotional, but every multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar business deal I've been involved with is full of emotion as well. And why is that? It's very interesting. It's because something's at stake besides the substance of the deal. Something's at stake. Like if you work in a hospital and you're buying something, that works out or doesn't work out. And that's the sort of subject of the deal. It works, doesn't work, works well. But it reflects on your career. It reflects on your job. It reflects on your reputation. And so the emotion comes in because there's consequences that flow from every deal. So the one I'm going to talk about was a $1 billion plus deal. It was many years ago, but it's a pattern that I have managed to repeat in my own life, but I try less and less to repeat it. But it generally comes when you've sort of convinced yourself that a deal must happen. And in this case, I watched a very intelligent, highly educated MIT engineer, MBA, Columbia, law degree, Harvard, decorated educational veteran, as it were, make a very bad acquisition decision because he was just committed to do it. And we all can do that, no matter how big or small the deal. We get committed to the deal and then start fighting and ignoring evidence around it. And that's, I think, a very common issue. And I've repeated it in my life. It's just an overcommitment to a deal, at which point we start exhibiting certain behaviors. And what I have done to reduce the number of times I do this myself is I've really memorized those behaviors, and I'm on the lookout for those behaviors from myself and from the people around me when we're all involved in a deal.
So that's interesting the way you frame that, of at least minimizing it's a problem. It's a behavior it's hard to completely eliminate, even with focus.
Yes. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Because, and it's an important survival skill that we make a decision. If we stood thinking in the savannah, do I run or do I stay? As a threat came at us, we don't make it to the next generation. And so decision making is extremely important. And knowing when you have enough to say, I'm making the decision, and when to sort of keep it open for alternatives, this is not a perfect science. This is a little bit of an art, and it's a little bit of training of our own instincts.
Mm-hmm.
But there are behaviors that if you see them, that ought to cause you to say, am I overly committed? Mm-hmm. And it could be a group. And when it's a group, people call it groupthink, mm-hmm. where, everybody's like, we're reaching consensus becomes like more important than the decision itself. But I've definitely got some warning signs to share with your audience about, hey, if you start to see these kinds of behaviors, it should make your antenna wiggle and step back and say, are we overly committed, too committed? Are we emotionally charged or what?
Yeah. So before, it would be great to hear those things to look out for. In the scenario you were thinking of, and I realize you might not, you probably shouldn't name names if there's confidentiality involved, but at least in generalities with the deal, saying it was a bad acquisition decision, like just speaking generally, like how and when was that clearly a bad outcome after acquisition?
And I can share it in general terms. It's many, many years ago. I talk about it in the book. So imagine this, that, we were a big public company and we wanted to buy another public company. And I don't mind talking about it being, both companies were in transportation. Uh-huh. And it was an interesting deal because it made sense, but not at the price that we ended up paying. Mm-hmm. And the story is basically the highly educated gentleman was negotiating with a rough and tumble entrepreneur who started a trucking company with his brother, like hauling eggs for farmers to market. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so he talk about street smarts, this guy, so it was street smarts versus Harvard, right? And what happened was, let's say the company was worth $1 billion. The deal was over $1 billion, but say it was worth $1 billion for hypothetical sake, and say the first bid was $400 million, based on kind of where the stock was trading, and a slight premium to market, $400 million. And you could justify that price based on projections. When you do deals, you do lots of different projections, and you got a high, a low, a medium. You've had accountants look at the quality of earnings, what's really sustainable. And so you end up with, okay, we came up with a fair price over market, $400 million. And these are private conversations at this point, so the market didn't react. Otherwise, you're really in trouble. And so the guy came back and just simply said, my company's not for sale, which is a very good thing to say when someone's trying to buy you. It's not for sale.
It's good.
It's a standard thing to say.
Yeah.
After he said that, and he wouldn't even counter. And so we kind of went to the top end of the projections, and now let's say we were at $600 million. And he just said, my company's not for sale. Okay. 600 million was really a high value for the company. That would have been a huge premium to the market. Mm-hmm. Everything would have to go perfectly in order for that price to work. Yeah. Let's say that was 20 times earnings, so you'd have to have 20 years of current earnings. And then finally, I'll just tell you that we ended up paying like $1.2 billion for the company. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the guy who sold it said, when he was speaking at the Harvard Club or somewhere himself, is street smart, no college education, said it came to him in a dream.
The number did.
And number 1.2 billion came to him in a dream, and The deal got done at 1.2 billion. It was a horrible deal. And I think we ended up selling it a 50% loss eventually, which, 600 million here, 600 million there, it adds up. So that's my favorite mistake, because not just because it's so egregious, but because the same elements of getting a deal wrong that went wrong there are in every deal, large or small. When we get overcommitted, that deal just had to happen. That maven, I call him in the book, that deal maven, was determined that deal had to happen, and that's where we ended up. So
yeah, I mean, I am rarely in a position to negotiate, but you think of the idea of at least a little bit of education I've had is the alternative of walking away. And I mean, I'm thinking of Kenny Rogers. You got to know when to walk away, know when to run. That seems to apply.
absolutely. If you have, we joke, those of us who have sold businesses, and I've sold a few, if you have one buyer, you have no buyer. Right? I mean, you need choices. Choices lead to better outcomes. That's that's my phrase. More choices equals better outcomes. And so no choices there. There should have been alternatives. There should have been the alternative walkway. But it's interesting. In this case, the situation was one where the economics of the Western U.S. really favored railroads, and the economics and geography of the East really favored trucking, because in the West you have long distances and it's flat. And in the East you have, lots of terrain and mountains and curves. And so the idea was that instead of a transcontinental railroad, we would be best off with a railroad in the West and a trucking company in the East, and the ability to hand off between them. And that was the theory. And Arthur D. Little and all the consultants years ago had done a great study saying, yes. And so once we were attached to that outcome, that's basically what happened.
So I'm trying to think what to ask you next, or I'll ask you, do you want to, we can hold the thought maybe on the things to look out for, because I think the martial arts aspect of your story is a fascinating one. Can we get into the martial arts practice first? So
yeah, sure.
I was going to ask you, how and when did you take interest in the martial arts? Was it something that you were just doing, let's say, for physical activity, or did you expect you might get some philosophical or mental epiphanies from it? What was your intent?
Really great question. I actually like how you asked that, because martial arts has an internal and an external side to it. And most people, depending on the higher educated people are, the more they tend to think about the internal arts. Whereas, I'm not discriminating against how educated someone is. It's just segments that way. Whereas, if you're don't have graduate degrees and such, or you think of martial arts as MMA and UFC.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting that you asked it that way. I started out in high school with karate in upstate New York. And I think I did that because I always grew up in fighting neighborhoods. I was born on the south side of Philly, upstate New York. I mean, and where I was, and then I grew up in Pittsburgh quite a bit. And I just saw a movie, Out of the Furnace, at the suggestion of somebody. And, all those kids do was fight. And that's what we did. We were near North Braddock and Forest Hills. And I was just in fighting neighborhoods. And I thought, I could use a little edge. It was just tough blue collar neighborhoods that I grew up in. You had to fight. Yeah. And so I started in high school, and I did it in college. And then, I jumped in law school and business school. I was so busy, I kind of lost that side of it. And then, when you're doing a career like everyone else, you get out of balance very quickly. You dive in, and all you can see is that need to climb and succeed. And so I lost balance. But then, and this is interesting, I was on a plane in 9/11, and we aborted takeoff. I was living in San Francisco, and I was taking off from Dallas to head back west, and we aborted takeoff and spent 4 hours on that plane. And I thought after that experience, I thought, you know what? I want to be someone who could thwart an attempt because I fly a lot, And so I got heavily back into it after 9/11. And by 2005, had gotten my first degree black belt in karate. I relocated to Dallas, and second degree in 2007, third degree in 2010. Took up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in 2007. I'm a brown belt. I've been doing that for 10 years. Black belt's next for me. Took up Aikido. And what was fun for me then was karate didn't take me internally, but with a philosophy, double major in philosophy and English, especially the philosophy side, I really started getting into the internal side when I took up Aikido, and then the Russian martial art is Sistema. So Aikido is the samurai martial art. And that's when I really got into the internal, the meditation, and the focus and the concentration. And all that happened about the same time I started writing books.
So I've got to take a quick detour, though, just to come back to, my gosh, what happened on 9/11 just 20 years ago now. So your flight was about to take off, and is that when they said clear the airspace, no more flights?
Yeah, we aborted takeoff. So I was at, let's say, 9:10 or something like that. Maybe it was 8:10 here, whatever. But it was enough that we started to take off and then came down. So we aborted takeoff, literally.
Did you know when you boarded the plane what had happened at that point already in New York?
No, nobody knew anything. We were going to take off.
Wow.
And then, and I was in seat 4B, in case you wondered, do I remember it? Yes, vividly.
Yeah.
And we didn't know for the first hour or two what was going on. They said there was a mechanical issue. They basically, I don't know if that's what they were told or if they lied to us, but
it could have been a mechanical issue on that day. Yeah.
About 2 hours into it, they said, due to terrorist activities out in the eastern US, we won't be taking off. And we spent 4 hours on the plane because once they ordered that ground stoppage, I think there were 4,000 planes in US skies. There aren't 4,000 gates.
Right.
You think you wait for a gate now. So we waited and waited for a gate. So that had an impression on me. I felt like, you know what? That was before I knew about, I think it was United 93 or whatever that crashed in Shanksville, where those really, really brave fellow Americans decided to just take it on. Yeah. Really unbelievable. I wanted to be that guy.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, with getting into writing books, we'll bring it back to, it's hard to transition away from thinking of that day, but what you learned from your refound practice of martial arts and new martial arts beyond your original karate. Like, how did you start connecting the dots? And your previous book, Listening, is a martial art, correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So how did you start weaving practices and what you've learned from martial arts into your writing and your business pursuits?
It was really, this Russian martial arts system is very internal. Jiu-jitsu's internal. Aikido's internal. By internal, I mean there are elements of, you can't really do the external well without the internal. So I don't remember whether I noticed it first with jiu-jitsu or with Sistema, but I remember it vividly with jiu-jitsu when I would work with somebody who was a world champion, and I only trained with world champions. I had the luxury of doing that. I would try to do something to them and they would disappear. And it was just fascinated me. And I talked to them a little bit. It's like, what's going on there? Well, they were studying me so intently. They knew what I was going to do before I did it and would move. So I never had any structure to work with against them. And the Russian did the same way, but it was more stand-up art. They would just disappear and you couldn't exert any force against them. So they were studying you so intently. And And that's when I got into the listening. I viewed them as listening in a way that was so far beyond what we do in our business lives. And that's why listening was the first one. We did training in the dark up in the woods in the Algonquin forest. So we every other year had a camp up there for a week. Okay. And we would work in the dark, in the water, whatever, with, former Russian special forces dudes,
Wow.
and we would do things where someone would walk towards you with a knife. Okay. And they would form an intention of whether they were going to harm you or not harm you 30 feet away from you, and then walk towards you. And you had to, it was a training knife, but they would hurt. And you had to discern whether they intended you harm or not. So that when they got to you, you either had to be prepared to block or be prepared to shake their hand. And we trained that over and over and again. And I will tell you that the level of focus, concentration, and listening made you able to pretty much get to the point where you could discern. And it wasn't like they were like putting on an angry face or a happy face. They were just coming to you. And so I was so blown away that I could be trained on intention, that I thought, if I can really learn this intention, think about how it would help me in face-to-face business.
So what I hear you saying is, the effective martial arts is not just reactive, a kick and then a punch and then a kick. There's this if you will, sizing up of your opponent, and how does that translate then into the practice of negotiating?
So if you study the person with whom you're dealing, okay, and I suppose somewhat the same thing happens in poker, reading tells and reading, you can know if they're listening to you, not listening to you, what they're thinking next, where they're headed, even before they're headed there, by what they look down at. So it's incredible advancement of your observational skills that helps you have an edge in dealing with another human being, that intense engagement. Where in martial arts, the consequences are, if you don't study it well enough, you get hit. So that really gets your attention. But in a business setting, even in a Zoom setting, your ability to essentially feel someone else can give you a great edge on what cards they're holding, what they're hiding, what they're thinking. Are they bluffing?
Yeah. Now, is that process of observation, which I imagine includes body language, listening not just to the words, but inflection, and like that all seems based off of our physical senses. This, what you're describing, is different than intuition, or does intuition enter into it at some point, do you think?
That's an excellent question. I think intuition always plays a role, because we see, millions of bits of data and decide what we react to. It's really quite amazing. If we really were conscious of everything that we're taking in from our senses, our heads would blow up. It'd explode. And so a variety of things filters what we see. And so those filters can work against us, right? Because, I might have trained my filters that you nodding is background noise, but really you nodding is extremely important, right? Me being aware of when you nod, when you don't nod. And so you need to remove some filters in order to gain these higher observational skills.
Yeah. Wow. So again, our guest is Cash Nickerson. His most recent book is Negotiation as a Martial Art. I want to make sure we come back and close the loop on, you had mentioned the things to look out for, and this was specifically things to look out for if your deal is a bad one. Is that right?
I would say these are things to look for if you're concerned about whether you made a rash decision. You're overcommitted to a decision. I think it's really bad. I'm reading a pretty good book that talks about, it says, take your 3 worst decisions in business and add up what you'd be worth if you hadn't made those decisions. And it's a really high number. And it's basically like being smart and doing brilliant things isn't as important as not doing dumb things. Mm-hmm. And so if you fear you might be doing something stupid, and it takes some humility to even imagine, to say, but what if it's a bad mistake? Mm-hmm. So I view this as anytime you're concerned, actually, I would take any major deal decision, whether you're just buying a copier mm-hmm. and run it by, say, do any of these behaviors, are any of them present? And then this might give you a hint to take another look, a second look, a third look.
So before we get into them, this is a broader framework for, am I making a mistake? It's
right.
Okay.
Am I going to pay a dumb tax? Is there going to be a dumb tax due on this?
Yeah.
Deal?
So what are those behaviors to look out for, Cash?
Some of the warning signs are any exaggerated terms. So anytime you hear, like if someone who works for you, if you're in a leadership position, comes to you, this is the best deal ever, this is the greatest thing on earth, this is, exaggerated terms should make your antenna quiver. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's true, but why do they have to say it? Mm-hmm. I'd just be happy if somebody said, I think this is a good transaction because of this and that. I think we should go with supplier A because of this. I think we should hire person B because of this. Whenever somebody says, we'll never see anyone like this again, then I think, uh-oh.
Yeah. And that could apply to hiring or other decisions.
All these are just really decisions. Because if you're in any kind of serious business role, the most important thing you do, and the thing you do every day, and the thing you do so naturally you don't even realize you're doing it, is make decisions. Mm-hmm. You sign things, you make decisions. Someone comes to you, say A or B, you say A. Okay. And maybe you get a good presentation, maybe you don't. But that's what executives do, make decisions. So I always beware exaggerated terms. Another one to watch out for, number 2 on my list, is sort of arguing or defensive-ness. Mm-hmm. As soon as you say, but what about this? They get a level of excitability or argument. Yeah. One of the things that you find is that, smart people are good at arguing. And so they can be very persuasive. And so, somebody, a highly educated person, and you say, well, I think we're going to go with A. And they say, well, here's why B is better, and I don't think you see it, and boom, 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 boom. It's like, maybe they're right, but at least I just wonder, why so defensive? Mm-hmm. If I'm wrong, let's talk about it. But the overreaction, heated, argumentative state. And then it's just sort of game on, battle on, right?
Yeah.
So that's a second one. A third one, and I saw this in this deal, is in making distinctions. It's like I believe it or not, when I went to Carleton College undergraduate, I had a professor of philosophy named Perry Mason. And Perry Mason said, when you're losing an argument, you need to do one of 2 things. You either need to change the subject or make a distinction. And changing the subject.
What's an example of that? Sorry.
Yeah. So making a distinction. So in the case of this trucking acquisition, what happened was we had numbers that said, here's what the less than truckload market is expected to grow at for the next 10 years. Here's the growth rate. And let's say it was 7%. Good growth rate. Excellent growth rate. So the less than truckload market, so, package market back then, would grow at 7%. Well, if you ran that 7% out, the best number you could get to is a value of $600 million. So what the numbers guys went back and did was say, oh, you know what? We can segment that less than truckload market into a fast less than truckload market and a slow less than truckload market.
Mhm.
And the fast less than truckload market, so quicker delivery times, is actually growing at 14%.
Yeah.
So made that distinction. Let's not just look at less than truckload. Look, we can slow and fast. So this is almost like a overly analytic state that is gonna, because what's someone doing it, they're trying to get to a result instead of an honest, intellectual, intelligent appraisal of options.
Yeah, it sounded like massaging the numbers to prove the point you wanted to make, as opposed to doing a good rational process of, well, we might decide to buy, we might decide to walk away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That might be someone like looking at buying a house, and you look at the growth rate of what appreciation could there be on the house, and if you look at it over a long period of time, it's a 4% growth rate. But last year was 20%. So you project the 20% forward, because it's like, I have a lot of friends who've been doing that lately.
From 20 to 21, yeah. Gosh.
Another one of my fun 7 is anytime people use the word strategic. Strategic is a euphemism for, let's throw the numbers out the window. No. This is a strategic acquisition. I've taught courses before in acquisitions where I've said, beware the strategic acquisition.
Yeah.
Because it means the numbers don't add up.
I learned that early in my career, even in the context of, let's say, strategic projects, that somebody like me as an engineer at the time, like, I'd have to make this business case, and you get to a certain point of the organization, an executive could just say, go do it. It's strategic. I heard the same thing even at that level of work.
The word strategic is kind of fun, because whenever somebody was like, they didn't know what else to do with an executive in a major corporation, they'd give them some little strategic title, and that's when you knew they were done.
They're assigned to strategic projects. Yeah.
Yeah, they were done. Here's a good one. And I kind of alluded to this in distinctions, but constant changes and assumptions. When you sit down and make a decision, you sit down and commit. Here's assumptions that we're basing this decision on. And those should be like bricks that hold your bridge up. But then someone comes back and says, maybe we were wrong about this brick. Maybe we don't need this brick. Well, you take that brick out, the bridge falls down. But if you take that brick out, I can get across, I can make this thing happen.
Yeah. That's a good.
So constant changes or changes in fundamental assumptions. This is very dangerous.
Yeah.
The use of power. Use of power. Just like, look, how long you had one guy say to me one time when I was questioning a decision, how long you been out of law school? I've been doing this, I have this, this power. I'm the executive vice president, I'm the vice president, I'm accountable, I'm the one. And like, that makes it smarter or better. I'm accountable. Well, now I feel better. Good to know. Right. What's that do for me? What's that worth? Can I take that to the bank? I'm accountable. I always love that when people say, no problem, I'm accountable. It's like, oh, well, that's good to know. That's going to be quite helpful in bankruptcy.
That word gets used a lot in different settings, like where I work in healthcare. Holding people accountable is a polite way of saying we're going to blame them for things that maybe weren't their fault. But I looked up the word accountable in the dictionary once. It basically it means to give account, to explain what happened. That's different than responsibility or ensuring success somehow.
It's just something accountable. Any use of any kind of power term, or I'm accountable and it's up to me, and it's maybe you ought to, maybe your antenna should quiver a little bit and take another look.
Yeah.
And my last one's kind of a favorite, because I spent time in the Silicon Valley. I spent time in the .com era, and what people would say out there, and they still sometimes say it you don't hear it as much in other parts of the country, but is it whether you get it or not? You don't get it. Oh no, he doesn't get it. And so early on in the tech bubble, it was like, Mark doesn't get it. Oh, or Mark, yeah, he gets it. When people would talk about revenue doesn't matter, it's eyeballs.
Right.
You know, which there was some truth to. I mean, early on, especially, it was like anybody who worried about revenue, there was no hope for you in the valley. Revenue,
We'll acquire users, and then we'll figure out the business model, I guess.
it was all about eyeballs. You know, how many eyeballs do you have?
I mean, saying somebody doesn't get it, that's just dismissive without having a good basis. And maybe that comes back to what you warned earlier about groupthink. Somebody who's not going along with the groupthink will get labeled, well, they don't get it, even if they're the one who is got the right assessment of the situation, and or they're the one willing, brave, or stupid enough to speak up about it.
It's my favorite fable, The Emperor Has No Clothes.
Yeah.
Which is the most vivid observation of groupthink. Nobody, and that fable, believe it or not, exists in many, many cultures. I researched at one time, and it was often about legitimacy, believe it or not. So really, really amazing. All over the world, that fable existed in cultures. Yeah,
it's interesting.
So this shows how deeply rooted these behaviors are.
Yeah. Well, Cash, I want to ask you one other thing. And again, I want to remind the audience, Cash Nickerson, the book, the full title is Negotiation as a Martial Art, Techniques to Master the Art of Human Exchange. So you can learn more. Cash's website is cashnickerson.com. But I've got to ask you, it's a follow-up to something we chatted about the other day before we recorded here. A book you said you might write. The title you gave me was Mistakes You Might Have Missed. So I wanted to see if you could tell the audience why you might do that.
You know, I've had a wonderful career so far of, you know, doing many things all over the world and many different types of things. Many people are smart and just do one thing, something they're really good at. I have turned ADD into a life, into a financial success, and so I think I've seen mistakes and done mistakes from so many different angles and so many different contexts. I think it'd be kind of fun to, you know, share what it's like to just see different facets that maybe people haven't seen, mistakes you might have missed. And with a hope that maybe it reduces, you know, some of the kind of mistakes that I've made that might help other people. And there's so many and so many interesting things. I've just been so lucky to meet so many different people. But I had one person tell me that God told them to buy my company. And I said, God told me to sell it to you. And that was my quick retort. Yeah. And it turned out to be a horrible deal because, you know, when you do a deal, you sometimes you're with the people for a long time. And it's like, you know, I just have lots of them. And I think we could almost have a mistakes club. You could have a nice club where we just got together, you know, periodically and shared, like, I'd like to call it lessons learned. Mistakes is kind of the negative side. And I think it's hard to plow forward, be optimistic. There's so much more money to be made in the future that I tend to like figure out what went wrong and then never re-guess the trade again. So it's like, I'm done. Okay, let's not do that again. Here's the seven things to look out for next time. And if I hear any of these things, I'm going to say, wait a minute, because I did repeat, you know, these on at least 2 other deals that I did. And I thought, man, I just did what I swore I would never do. So
I hear what you're saying. You know, I think there's a balance to be found, and we want to recognize mistakes. We want to reflect on it, but not to dwell on it. Maybe there's a point where, you know, because, you know, the tone and the theme of this podcast is not beating ourselves up or beating up the guest for why'd you do that. But there's probably a point of saying, okay, I've learned from it. I've analyzed it. I know what I would try to do differently in the future, where, to your point, if people miss the mistake, if they don't realize it's a mistake, or they quickly just brush it aside, like they're in denial, then they're doomed to repeating it, right?
I will tell you, you'll be thrilled to know this, probably because it really endorses your search here and your podcast. I won't deal with anyone who says they never had a failure.
Mm-hmm.
I just won't,
mm-hmm.
because either they've never reached far enough or they're lying to me.
Mm-hmm.
And often it's the latter. So why would I want to do business with somebody that told me they never made a mistake? Anybody, I know it's not a political show, but if somebody says to you, well, everything I do, I'm a winner and I always win, I know that I can't trust them right out of the gate. I know it. And that's a problem. I was thinking about a deal that I did, and all these things were present, and yet I did it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, this is what I learned from that one, I had private equity investors in a deal, and they were pushing me. Say, listen, we need this return on our numbers, so you got to do deals.
Yeah.
And I did a deal I shouldn't have done because I had outside people pressuring me, but I still did it. And so my lesson learned from that was, just because someone pushes you into it is not an excuse. You have to make the decision. Say no. If they don't like it, I think that can be hard sometimes, because we speak as if we have the power to decide and control things.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes there's other players involved, and there's pressures. And it could be a pressure of, oh no, if I don't do this, I'm out of business. That's a common pressure. It could be a pressure. My investors are demanding a 20% return. If I don't do this deal, they won't get it. Mm-hmm. And so I think, in fairness to ourselves, when we make mistakes, I tell people this: successes are team efforts, and so are failures. Right? It's a team effort. And so maybe the best we can do is try and create a culture where we hold each other accountable to help reduce the number of times we make a collective bad decision, because we all just see like we got to do it.
Well, Cash, if you end up writing that book, maybe we can talk again here on the podcast. Maybe this podcast can become the official podcast that your club members listen to. But I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And, one thing I've been trying to do with the podcast is, in a way, normalizing being open about mistakes. I appreciate that you and all my other guests have been willing to come on and share something that, on some level, people always like to tell the stories that paint themselves in the best light. But to me, the fact that people are willing to admit these things and grow and help others, to me, that right there, that's a really positive light too.
It's very healthy. One thing I do, and I make my students do it in class, I always do a preview and review of every significant meeting, a negotiation, a deal. What I think would happen, what did happen, lessons learned. It's so, if you can't learn, then, that's a problem. But I will tell you, I lost several $1 million when I repeated this mistake, all the same behaviors, but I was pressured into it. And I can't have that excuse. I was pressured into it. Now, when I feel myself pushed in a direction that I know isn't good, I just stop and say, I can't go that direction. I'm going to tell you why. And here's the 7 things. And I can see 5 of them right now surfacing. You're pushing me. You're arguing with me. You're trying to convince me this is strategically important, And so here's my 7. You've hit 5. So I can't do it. Mm-hmm. One other thing that I've been thinking about lately is, and this is great to help reduce the number of mistakes we make, is I'm trying to get better at saying no. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to get better at saying no. You meet some people and all they do is say no. But for those of us that are positive and want to sell and want to get things done, no is hard. But no is the key to making fewer mistakes and not having to pay that dumb tax.
Well, that's great advice, Cash. A lot of great advice that you shared with us here in the episode again today. So again, the book is Negotiation as a Martial Art, Techniques to Master the Art of Human Exchange. Cash Nickerson has been our guest. Cash, I'm glad you didn't start the practice of saying no when I asked you to do the podcast. Thanks for saying yes.
Well, you didn't exhibit any of the 7 behaviors.
But glad to hear it.
What a pleasure. Thanks, Mark. I really
Likewise.
enjoyed it.
Thanks, Cash.